Hello and welcome back to the Dixie Belle YouTube channel. My name's Connie and I'm one of your Dixie Belle brand ambassadors. In the video today, I'm going to show you how I took this side table, which cost me £10 from a charity shop, and I used terra clay paint to turn it into something really funky and bohemian. So you know the score by now. We've got to clean it first. That's the first thing that I always do. No matter what condition it's in, where it's come from, I always clean first. This just helps you establish the condition of the piece as well, and it gives you a nice blank canvas to work on. So I'm using Dixie Belle's White Lightning Cleaner that I have put in a spray bottle and watered down, and then I'm going to rinse it with clean water afterwards. I then went ahead and scuff sanded the entire piece with my electric sander. As you can see, it is taking off quite a lot of that dark varnish, but my main aim here is just to scuff up that shiny surface and basically remove some of that factory finish because it was very shiny. So I just want to give something to basically for my paint to grip onto. And I also sanded the top because there was a couple of dings in there which I did fill, so I'm just making sure that they're super smooth. Once the prep was all done, I then applied a base of Moonbeam, which is the white from the Terra Clay Paint line. I'm using a natural bristle brush, so the brush that I'm using here is a premium chip brush, and I'm using stippling motions as opposed to traditional brush strokes, which is when you just pounce the brush on the surface, and that's just going to give me a little bit of texture in the paint finish. Once that white base coat was completely dry, I then went in with a few more colours because obviously I wanted this piece to be really colourful. So I'm using a trio of blues here. I've got Cerulean Blue, I've got Lanny's Lagoon, and I've also got Blue Moon. And I'm using 3 different premium chip brushes for each colour. And I'm really just kind of having to play around with colour placement at the moment. Obviously it's kind of looking like a hot mess, but this is just kind of building up some layers. I'm also using a hairdryer to blast the layers in between. This is just going to speed up the drying process, and it stops me having to kind of wait around for paint to dry. I'm also using no water at this stage. So if I was to introduce water, what would happen is all the colours would kind of sort of blend together. Terra Clay Paint blends beautifully, but I don't want that kind of look for this. I want a really kind of layered look. So I am just building up the layers of blue and just kind of playing around with what looks right. So as you can see, I'm just adding a little bit of shading in the deeper blue here. This is the colour Blue Moon. And it is really just about playing around with colour placement. There's no real kind of rhyme or reason as to where I place those colours. I just kind of kept adding a bit and layering a bit. And then I also introduced a little pop of contrasting colour, which is the colour Daffodil, which is a really bright, vivid yellow. Obviously, because I am layering it over blue, it kind of mutes it down a little bit. But again, I'm not using any water here. I'm just kind of relying on the paint to kind of layer over each other. If you're wondering what brush I'm using here, it's actually a Stencil brush because I had no clean premium chip brushes left and I'd use them all with the blues. As you can see, I also work the same theme around the piece. I'm sort of concentrating a darker blues on the edges of the piece, not strictly just the edges, but mainly the edges, and that's going to create a little bit of dimension to the very flat surface. I also painted the back of this piece because I just thought it'd finish it off nicely, and also because it's a sort of side table, it can be used in various different parts of the room. So I decided for that reason to paint the back. And again, at no point of this process did I use or introduce any water. I'm using dry brushes, and I'm also taking the excess paint off of my brush with a rag or shop cloth, and that just means that you aren't putting a huge amount of paint on the surface, so you don't end up with sort of heavy splodges. You've got more of a very soft kind of dry brushed layered look. So once it had dried completely and I was happy with all the layers and how they were kind of looking, I went back in with some sandpaper. Now terra clay paint distresses beautifully, and it wet distresses and dry distresses very well. I did a little bit of a combination of both here. So I wet distressed around the edges, which you just saw me doing at the very back end of that last clip. And that's when you take a rag that is damp and just rub it, which rubs away at the paint. Dry distressing is generally when you get sandpaper, like I've got here, or a sanding sponge, and you sand away at certain areas. So all I'm really doing is just really gently sanding away at some of the areas to reveal the dark wood underneath. Again, it's just something that I like to do to add a little bit of definition and interest. And it's also just going to pick out that carved detail that is on the drawer fronts. So the final thing to do is to seal it. So terra clay paint has to be sealed. And I'm using Terra Tough, which is my favourite top coat to date. I absolutely love this stuff. It applies super easy, it doesn't reactivate the paint, and it gives a really gorgeous sheen. So I'm just using a large flat brush here to apply the Terra Tough, and I'm using a very, very light hand, and I'm using very thin coats. And what you'll notice when you use Terra is that it dries lighter, a considerable amount lighter than what it does, what it looks like when it is wet. But once you apply your top coat, it brings all those gorgeous colours back to life, and it just makes them look like they did when you applied it. I also decided to do a little bit of a peekaboo drawer detail on the sides of the drawers. I'm using a brand new stencil called When Life Gives You Lemons, and it's super intricate and detailed. So I'm using some spray adhesive to keep it flat on the surface, and that's just going to help with all those kind of little bits of detail and keep them super flat while I'm stenciling. I used the colour Cerulean Blue, which is one of the colours that I used on the outside of the cabinet, and I'm using it with the Belle brush. I'm just adding a little bit of paint onto the bristles, then removing it onto a rag. So you're taking the excess paint off onto the rag so that you've not got too much paint on your bristles, and then just dabbing it really lightly over the stencil. I also went back and added some Best Dang wax in brown just around the drawer edges and in the corners to add a little bit of definition, and also adds a little bit of depth to the paint colour. Now, because I've already done a top coat with Terra Tough, I don't have to apply a coat of clear wax first. I'm just obviously going to use the Best Dang wax in brown straight over the top. And I'm just using a very, very small amount of the wax and just kind of dispersing it out so there's no harsh lines. And I also rubbed it back with a cloth just to kind of make it look a little bit more softer. Last but not least, I added some gold gilding wax to the original handles, which were a little bit dull and dated. And this wax is a permanent oil-based wax, so it's perfect for updating handles, hardware and hinges. You just apply it with a small brush or your finger, and if you can see, I'm just tapping it here, and that's just going to give me a little bit more of an antique-y finish rather than a perfectly smooth finish. And then I also decided to add the gold gilding wax around the drawer edges, and that's just going to give it a little bit more of a sparkle when you open the drawer out. Here's how the drawer sides finished up. I didn't mention this earlier on, but I did seal them with the same Terra Tough top coat as I did the rest of the piece. Hopefully you can see all the layers that I built up on the drawer fronts there. Thank you for watching this little video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you've got any questions, please drop them in the comments below. Make sure you hit subscribe on the Dixie Belle YouTube channel.